what's going on, guys? Hope you're all having a great day. Paul Borgid here, and today we're going to be talking to a very special guest. That's Dan Johnson. He's the one of the newest curate in St. Mark's. Okay, he's been there for a couple of months, but not many of you know him because he's like one of those guys who's like a man of mystery. But today we're going to unravel a mystery that I think only he could explain it better than most people. We're going to be talking today about why is there suffering and why does God allow suffering? And that's something that's going to be so interesting, especially at this particular period of time. And as you can see, this is like the whole lockdown beard, the lockdown hair, and hopefully this thing ends soon. But just make sure that you pay attention to what Dan's going to be saying, and hope you guys all have a great day. So Dan, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Paul. Thanks for introducing me.
How are you managing the whole social distancing?
It's all right. Unfortunately for me, we're talking about suffering. I have a problem with my immune system, which means I'm slightly more locked down than other people, but that's great. It means people bring food to my house. It means you bring food to my house. It means I have kind neighbours that cook me dinner most days. And I've got a housemate who's vicariously keeping me entertained.
So basically you've got like the best deals so far from compared to everyone else.
So far, so good.
So Dan, like we've known each other now past couple of months, but I'm not sure the youth know you that well. So could you like let us know like a bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm a curate at St Mark's. For those of you who don't understand the Church of England's strange language, a curate is like a junior vicar. It's the point in your training when the Church of England essentially says, right, you've read enough books, now we need to let you practice on the general public. So, I've been ordained for about 3 months now. I live in Clapham Junction, not married, live with a housemate, have some cracking neighbours, and I run a house group with Christine Dobbin in it as well, who I believe is a volunteer within youth. So yeah, that's me really.
That's great. So today, we're going to be talking about why is there suffering and why does God allow suffering in the world? Like, what's your background when it comes to all of this?
Well, that's a good question actually, Paul. So, and I'll unpick this a little bit more in the talk, but essentially for the first 20 years of my life, I wasn't a Christian. I would have described myself as a materialist atheist. I didn't believe in God, and I thought the only thing that existed was that which we could touch, feel and smell. Very much a sort of hard materialism. I then became a Christian, and quite soon after became unwell, and I've spent a lot of the last 20 years in and out of hospitals, having injections, having medical treatments, sitting on IV drips, and that has taught me a great deal about suffering. But also within that period, and I know people who suffer from physical illnesses have the same thing, I've suffered with mental illness as well, and anxiety in that period. And I have to say that I think anxiety is an altogether different experience. Mental illness is very different to physical illness. And that has probably been even more difficult than the physical things I struggled with. And they're not as easy actually to deal with. You know, if your leg hurts, you can take some tablets or you can chop it off. If your brain is in pain, if you discover one day that your brain is not on your side, which I think is the core of a lot of mental illness, then that's slightly more difficult to neutralise, and hopefully that gives me a slightly unique understanding as to the whole subject of suffering.
Oh, that's great, Dan. So without much further ado, I'm going to just let you take over and give you all the space that you want and all the creative license. Guys, make sure you pay attention to what he says and just share this with each and every one of your friends as well as people in your family, because this is something that we could be talking about, especially this particular period of time and also in every aspect of our lives. So Dan, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Paul. So I'd like to take some time to look at the somewhat thorny issue of suffering. And I have to say it's always with some trepidation that I come to this subject. You know, I've been leading an Alpha group this term, and it struck me that quite a few of the questions that come up on Alpha are really interesting, but by and large some of them are theoretical. So one of the questions that's come up quite a lot in all the groups is, how was the Bible put together, and are there good manuscripts for the Bible? Now that's fascinating, but in one sense there either are good manuscripts or there aren't, and the answer is theoretical and not particularly personal. But the interesting thing about suffering is not really a theoretical question. It's often a profoundly personal one. And the truth is, I don't know where any of you are coming from. I don't know if you've lost someone close to you. I don't know if you're struggling physically. I don't know if you're struggling with a mental health issue. So it is with some trepidation that I come to this subject. So I thought it'd be good to look at 4 different areas in this talk. The first one, why does God allow suffering? The second, why does God allow such extreme suffering? The third, what's the point of suffering? And fourth, where is God in suffering? So let's kick off with the first one. Why does God allow suffering? I think this is probably the most asked questions on any Alpha course, any Christianity Explore course, or that any Christian's ever been asked when they've been out with friends who don't go to church. I think the thing where you want to start is the idea that it wasn't God's plan to have suffering in the world. There's a story told, and many of you probably know it, at the beginning of the Bible in Genesis, that explains that human beings wanted independence from God. It's a classic story, really, and the whole point of the story is not that we blame Adam and Eve. It's not the idea that they got it wrong, but somehow we wouldn't. The whole point of the story is that we are supposed to read ourselves into that story, and that God allowed that freedom, that decision to choose away from him out of respect for us. In fact, it's our ability to have choices, good or bad, that gives us freedom. But why did God allow us to turn away from him? Now that is a good question. Why not undo it? You know, one of the great things about life is the fact that we get to decide who we let into our strange little worlds. We get to decide who we're friends with, who we date, and maybe one day who we'll marry. But imagine a world in which God undid those decisions if he didn't agree with them. You see, it's the ability to choose, to make free choices that makes us human. And to carry on that theme of who we let in, one of the great choices that we have is we get to choose if we let God in. The Bible, you see, is clear that we can choose apart from God. But then when we try to live independently from him, things start to go wrong. We start to see all sorts of consequences, and God allows it because he respects our freedom, and that is the thing that essentially stops us from being robots. But the good news is that God has placed a limit, not on the consequences, but on the time in which he's allowed these things to go on for, which is something that I'll come back to at the end of the talk. So that's the first point. Why does God allow suffering? But let's turn to the even more thorny issue of why does God allow such extreme suffering in the world? Why do we see such extreme suffering in the world? And surely those sort of things are proof that God can't exist. You know, one of the mistakes I made as an atheist was that I spoke into a subject of which I had very little idea. So, as I explained in my introduction, for the first 20 years of my life I was an atheist, and my life, if I'm to be entirely honest, was an incredibly fortunate one. I hadn't experienced war, hadn't experienced famine, bereavement, homelessness. In fact, I'd grown up in a wealthy part of the world with a loving family and a good education. You see, my argument against the existence of God was one based on what I would call observed suffering. You know, I would watch the news and I would see all these horrible things and think God can't possibly exist. This came to a head in the 1980s when I watched something called Live Aid, which was a concert put on by some rock stars to try and earn some money and give some money to people struggling with famine in Africa. One of the things that came out of Live Aid was they would broadcast live from the famine, and we suddenly had, for the first time in our lives in the UK, the reality of that famine in Ethiopia. And we saw on our TV screens starving children, people going without food, literally dying because they were absolutely starving. Now, one of the reasons I find the whole thing interesting is because it happened in a continent which has suffered far more than Europe, where I live. Now, by my own theory, if suffering naturally leads to atheism, Africa should have been an entirely atheistic country. But the strange thing is that simply wasn't supported by the facts. In fact, if you look to the continent of Africa, faith, belief in God was alive and well. It was almost in this extreme suffering that these people in this continent had learned to find God in it. One of the interesting things to me whenever there's sort of Red Nose Day or sports relief is they always send some poor suspecting TV star or reality star to some part of Africa. And they almost universally say the same thing. They come back and say, wow, this culture, this country is rich in the things that you cannot buy. So the argument that extreme suffering should naturally lead to atheism is absolute nonsense. Where you see places which have had extreme suffering, it does not lead to atheism. Let's look at one of the other extremes, one of the things that really gets raised often when it comes to the subject of suffering, and that is, why do children have to suffer and why do children have to die? I find this an absolutely fascinating argument, and I'm aware it's slightly theoretical, but I want you to try and imagine a different world. A world where, let's say, children before the age of 12 simply do not suffer. Nothing bad can come of their lives. They can jump off a building, they don't pick up any illnesses. What would the results be for that world? Would their parents still care for them because they know they're indestructible? What would the consequences be for the children themselves who thought they were indestructible? What would happen in a world where no consequences happen? More importantly, what would happen when those children turn 13 and suddenly they are vulnerable to the world? What would that world look like? This is one of those ideas which is interesting to sort of throw around. How can we construct a different world where we had limited suffering? And my question is always, tell me what that world would look like. Tell me how you would adjust a world in which suffering was okay, but we still have freedom. Let's pick another example. There was a girl who lived in Australia called Sophie Delzio. She was at play school one morning when a bus crashed into her play school, and she suffered some fairly horrific injuries. About 6 years later, her parents were crossing the road with her and a car hit her. A second horrible event had happened. What was interesting was a lot of the news coverage of the event said, how could God allow this to happen? This is ridiculous. But again, these are horrible things. But imagine a world in which you can have something happen bad once, but then nothing ever happen bad to you again. Again, try and construct a universe in your world in which we in some way limit consequences of actions, but we maintain the ability for human beings to have freedom. Philosophers have tried this for thousands of years, trying to balance what they think is a good life with the consequences of people's actions and suffering. If I can try and summarize all their attempts, it's this. We either have freedom and consequences or we don't, and we either have the full range of consequences and the full range of freedom or we don't. So that's my second point. What about our third point? What's the point of suffering? Now, I know this is a particularly unpopular one, but I do think that one of the main points of suffering is it's supposed to be something that we learn from. The Christian writer C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, pain is God's megaphone to a suffering world. In other words, there's something about suffering that's supposed to wake us up, to rouse us from our slumber. I don't know about you, but I've learned quite a lot from COVID-19. I've learned a lot from this period of self-isolation. I've certainly learned what I appreciate. Who are the people I enjoy spending time with? What are the things I value? What are the things that I want to do once this lockdown is over? Like C.S. Lewis has said, it has really woken me up to the things that are really important. Now, I think it's important to stress that God doesn't want us to suffer. He doesn't cause us to suffer. I suppose God is a bit like a parent who watches a child swing too high on a swing and fall off. He's not caused it, but he certainly wants that child to learn from it, as the parent does. I think the other important thing to remember about suffering is how we deal with it helps us comfort other people. I'm a massive fan of music. One of my favourite bands is a band called the Counting Crows. Now, when I was about 19, I like to think some of you will find this hard to believe, but I got dumped and heartbroken. I was absolutely gutted. I hadn't seen it coming. She was very clear as to it was my fault why I got dumped. And for the first time in my life, I really felt like my heart had been shattered. And I turned to music. there was an album called August and Everything After by this band called Counting Crows. And in it, I heard somebody else articulate song after song after song about heartbreak and loss. And it was through hearing his explanation and his ability to put into words how I felt that I felt comforted in my own suffering. And so that's one of the great gifts that we have, is through our own suffering and learning from it, we can help comfort others. You know, there are some Christians that say that once you've become a Christian, you really shouldn't suffer again. They say that your life should be full of wealth, health, and prosperity. You know, I have to say, I wonder whether these Christians have actually read the New Testament or not. There's a fascinating story that we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, where the Apostle Paul talks about the extent of his sufferings when he's travelling through Asia on a missionary journey. This is how he describes his life at the time. He says, "We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so much so that we despaired of life." So this is the Apostle Paul speaking after he's been baptized in the Holy Spirit, saying that he understands that feeling of not wanting life to go on anymore. Now, if the other Christians are right, that after we've been baptized in the Spirit we shouldn't suffer anymore, we should rip these pages out of the New Testament. But Paul seems to be saying, actually, that suffering here is part of the normal Christian experience. So the fourth question is, why does God allow suffering? You know, when I hit my 30s, I started to get regularly invited to dinner parties. It was great, apart from the fact that if you're a trainee vicar and the people there have had 3 or 4 glasses of wine, you're going to get asked questions about why God allows so much suffering. One of the things that pricked my ears up, though, was that at one of these particular dinner parties, the whole evening was basically spent describing how bad the world had got. We were talking about environmental catastrophe. People were saying how horrible it was that we were constantly involved in wars, how economic collapse was happening all around us, how things were just generally getting worse, and we were one generation away from a nuclear war. I then stayed in touch with those people at the dinner party. And what amazed me was, despite their acute ability to articulate how rubbish the world was, these same people went on to have children. You know, people still ask, why would God create a world with so much suffering? And I sort of wanted to say to them, why would you bring children into a world which has so much suffering? We accuse God on the one hand, and yet we do the same ourselves when we have children. Jesus actually repeats one verse throughout the New Testament. And given that the New Testament is edited, it's always really important to ask, why is this verse repeated? He says, "I am never alone. My Father is always with me." And I actually think the people at the dinner party actually understood that to a degree. I think this is what their theory was. We know the world is full of difficult things. We know there are some extreme things. But we hope, when we have children, that within that family unit, hopefully, we can deal with most of the things that the world has to throw at us. And that's why Jesus repeats this verse. "I am never alone, my Father is always with me." And that is the reality for Christians, that despite everything that is going on, we are never alone in it. You know, when I was an atheist, I used to get angry with God. The irony is not lost on me. I would often just get so irritated, and I would think, you know what, God, if you were vaguely loving, you would have the decency to leave heaven, you would come to earth, you would see all this suffering, and surely your heart would break. But interestingly, the story of the gospel is this, that God did leave heaven, he did come to earth, he did see all the suffering, and his heart did break. But the good news is that wasn't the end of the story. And what we learn is that God came so that human beings could have a relationship with him. And even when Jesus had left the earth, he left his Spirit with us so that that relationship could be maintained until he returned. Or maybe a simpler way of putting it is, Jesus came so that me and you could say, "I am never alone, my Father is always with me." Okay, so we've covered our 4 important questions about suffering. But I'd like to finish by asking one simple question. When will suffering end? You know, Christianity, like other worldviews, has what is called a meta-narrative. Now, that's an absolutely horrible philosophical term, but it simply means what is the big picture in life. Some meta-narratives are circular, like Hinduism and Buddhism. You go round and round and round. Some are linear. You have a beginning, middle, and end. Now, the Christian meta-narrative is actually a beginning, middle, and eternity. So the basic Christian understanding is that actually this part of life where suffering is so abundant is only a very small part of the overall journey that we're on. There's no better place where this is articulated than in the book of Revelation in chapter 23, where we get these words. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." I mean, isn't that amazing? He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. You know, I do think there are good and satisfactory answers to the problem of suffering. But I don't know that this side of heaven we will always understand why we suffer. Suffering to some degree before we meet Jesus is inevitable. But I guess the big question I want to leave you with is this. Would it be okay if you didn't always understand why you were suffering, as long as there was a promise that you wouldn't be alone in it?
Dan, thank you so much for that. That was amazing. Seriously, that's like some question that even I've been struggling with over the past couple of years. And I'm pretty sure it's not just for the youth, but for others also. And this is my challenge to each and every one of you who's watching this. Make sure you share this with everyone that you know, because you never know what's happening within their house or within their room. Because people have these questions, but they want to hear about it. And now is your choice. Now is your superpower of sharing this with them. Let's make the world a better place. And this was the song when Live Aid came. Heal the world, make this a better place for you and for me and the entire human race. And let's do that. Let's go forward with this. Let's go forward with the word of God in our lives and the excitement and joy that we get in knowing that through him all things are possible, and that death cannot defeat us, that it is not going to conquer us, that we, along with God, along with his spirit that is there within each and every one of us, are able to do so many things. So let's take this time and opportunity to praise him and thank him for the day that we have, and for the family that we have, and for the fellowship that we have in him. Take care, have a nice day. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe